What is this? The glutton for punishment contest?
Cerveza.
It didn't look like television. It didn't sound like it either. Hill Street Blues hit screens in 1981 like a fist through drywall, loud, chaotic, morally broken, and completely alive. Critics didn't know what to call it. Networks didn't know how to sell it. And the first time audiences sat down to watch it, half of them changed the channel, the other half never recovered. Behind the badge, behind the precinct walls, behind the Emmy wins and the Cultural Revolution, there was something darker. Addiction, betrayal, nervous breakdowns, a showrunner so controlling he drove grown men to tears, and a network that nearly pulled the plug after episode 1. These are 20 dark facts about Hill Street Blues. And trust me, the stuff that happened off camera makes the show look tame. Hi, my name is Jerry, and this is Film Noir. Let's roll call. And hey, be careful out there. Number 1. Before Hill Street Blues ever aired a single frame, NBC had already decided it was probably going to fail. The network commissioned the pilot under serious financial pressure, handing the project to Steven Bochco and Michael Kozol, almost as a throwaway assignment. The two writers were famously handed a brief that was so vague it basically said, make a cop show. No further guidance, no creative parameters, no safety net. Bochco later recalled that the freedom wasn't a gift, it was a brush-off. NBC didn't expect greatness. They expected filler. When the pilot came back raw, overlapping, multi-storylined, and deliberately messy, executives were deeply uncomfortable. One network suit reportedly walked out of the screening room without saying a word. Another asked if the sound equipment was broken. This because surely no one intentionally made television this noisy and confusing. NBC scheduled it in a graveyard time slot and quietly braced for cancellation. The show premiered to some of the worst ratings in primetime history, ranking 97th out of 98 shows in its first season. 97th out of 98. Let that sink in, and yet somehow, against every odds, it survived. But only barely, and only because of one very uncomfortable phone call between Bochco and the president of NBC. Number 2. The chaos you saw on screen, the overlapping dialogue, the crowded roll call room, the sense that 17 things were happening at once. That wasn't a stylistic choice the network approved. It was a deliberate act of rebellion by Steven Bochco. Television in 1981 operated on clean sightlines, clear exposition, and one storyline at a time. Audiences were not supposed to have to work. Bochco thought that was insulting. He wanted viewers to feel the precinct the way a cop actually experienced it. Overwhelmed, loud, never fully in control. He told his directors to let scenes bleed into each other. He told his writers to leave storylines unresolved for weeks. He told his actors to move through the frame like they had somewhere else to be, because their character always did. Network executives watched early cuts and begged him to simplify. Bochco refused so consistently and so passionately that meetings reportedly ended in raised voices. One producer described sitting in a room with Bochco during a notes session as negotiating with a man who has already decided the negotiation is over. The result was a show that permanently changed the grammar of American television. But boy, oh did it almost not happen. Number 3. Daniel J. Travanti, who played the iconic Captain Frank Furillo, carried a secret through most of his time on the show that very few people knew about during production. He was a recovering alcoholic, sober for years, before filming began, and he brought that experience directly into Furillo's character. A man quietly battling addiction while maintaining a facade of iron control. What made this remarkable and genuinely dark is that Travanti never publicized this during the show's run. He was performing the emotional and psychological truth of recovery in front of millions of viewers every week, while almost nobody on the outside understood where that depth was actually coming from. Now, colleagues later said, there were moments on set where Travanti's intensity wasn't entirely acting. He was mining real pain, real discipline, real fragility. The scenes where Furillo grips the desk, jaw tight, breathing through a situation that would destroy a lesser man. Those weren't written into the stage directions. That was Travanti filling silence with something lived. He eventually spoke more openly about his sobriety in later years, but during Hill Street's peak, that performance was built on a foundation the audience could feel, but never fully see, which, honestly, makes it even more remarkable.
What is it? Did you make that phone call I suggested last night? You need help, Jay.
Number 4. Michael Conrad, who played the beloved Sergeant Phil Esterhaus and delivered the show's legendary sign-off line, "Let's be careful out there," was terminally ill for a significant portion of Hill Street Blues' run, and the production kept it almost entirely hidden from the public. Conrad had been diagnosed with cancer, and as the seasons progressed, the physical toll became increasingly visible to those on set. Writers quietly began reducing his workload, restructuring scenes around his limitations, ensuring he could still anchor the roll call sequences that had become the emotional heartbeat of the show. Cast members have since described the atmosphere on set during those later seasons as deeply emotional. People knew what was happening, nobody talked about it openly, and yet everyone showed up and did the work out of love for Conrad and respect for what he'd built. When he passed away in 1983, the show handled his character's death with unusual dignity for television at the time. But the grief wasn't performed. It was real. The entire cast had been quietly mourning for months. "Let's be careful out there" hit differently after that. It still does. "I'm not crying, you're crying, moving on."
That situation, a little extra effort.
Number 5. Stephen Bochco's relationship with NBC during Hill Street Blues' run was not a collaboration. It was a cold war with better catering. Bochco fought the network constantly, over content, over budget, over creative control, and the battles were ugly. NBC wanted softer storylines. Bochco wanted addiction, corruption, rape, poverty, and institutional failure on primetime television. NBC wanted likable heroes. Bochco wanted compromised, exhausted, morally ambiguous human beings. The network repeatedly threatened to cancel the show or pull particular episodes. There are documented instances of executives demanding rewrites on completed scripts days before filming, which Bochco either ignored or responded to with a counter-argument so thorough it buried the notes entirely. One network executive reportedly told a colleague that dealing with Bochco felt like trying to redirect a freight train using a firmly worded memo. Bochco was eventually fired from the show in 1985. Fired from the show he created, the show that saved NBC's Thursday night, the show that had won the network more Emmys than it knew what to do with. The official reason was budget disputes. The unofficial reason, depending on who you ask, was simply that nobody could control him, which, if you've seen the show, tracks completely. Number 6. The role of Officer Andy Renko, played by Charles Hayde, was nearly written out of the show entirely after the pilot, not because of poor performance, but because network executives thought the character was too abrasive, too loud, and too politically uncomfortable. Renko was written as a complicated Southern white cop navigating a racially diverse precinct, and that complexity made certain executives deeply nervous. They wanted the racial dynamics simplified, softened, made less confrontational. Bochco and Kozol refused. They argued that sanitizing Renko's worldview would make the show dishonest and would undercut the very thing that made the precinct feel real. The tension between Renko and his black partner Bobby Hill, played by Michael Warren, was intentional and essential. It was supposed to be uncomfortable. That discomfort was the point. The debate over Renko's future reportedly went several rounds before the writers held firm and the character survived. And it turned out to be one of the best decisions in the show's history, because the Renko-Hill partnership became one of television's most nuanced explorations of race, friendship, and institutional loyalty ever put on screen. Sometimes the thing that makes executives nervous is exactly the thing worth protecting. Number 7. Veronica Hamill, who played Joyce Davenport, the sharp, principled public defender who becomes Fiorillo's partner and eventually his wife, was not the first choice for the role. And the actress who was originally cast was replaced under circumstances that were, depending on the source, either a creative disagreement or something considerably more uncomfortable. What's documented is that Hamill stepped into the role relatively late in pre-production and immediately transformed it. Yaz, she brought an intelligence and a controlled ferocity to Davenport that felt entirely new for female characters on network television at the time. Davenport wasn't a love interest with depth sprinkled on top. She was a fully realized professional with her own moral framework, her own cases, her own failures, and a relationship with Fario that was built on intellectual equality rather than romantic convenience. Hamill later spoke about the difficulty of maintaining that characterization against network pressure to soften Davenport, to make her warmer, more accommodating, less confrontational. She pushed back. Bochco backed her, and the result was a character that female viewers wrote letters about. Real letters, the kind that take stamps, saying she was the first woman on television they actually recognized as someone like themselves. Number 8. The writing room for Hill Street Blues was, by multiple accounts, a pressure cooker that chewed through talent at an alarming rate. Bochco ran it with an intensity that inspired some writers and genuinely broke others. The hours were brutal, the standards were uncompromising, and the creative arguments were not gentle exchanges of professional opinion. They were full contact, emotionally charged, occasionally personal. More than one writer left mid-season citing exhaustion, creative differences, or what one former staffer diplomatically described as an environment not suited to everyone's nervous system. Bochco expected writers to bring complete, fully realized stories, not outlines, not concepts, but stories, and then expected to tear them apart in the room without anyone taking it personally. Some thrived in this. Others found themselves sitting in their cars in the parking lot at 11 p.m., wondering how they ended up here. What came out of that room, though, was consistently some of the most sophisticated dramatic writing American television had produced. The process was brutal. The product was extraordinary. That trade-off has been debated in Hollywood writing rooms ever since, though usually in slightly lower voices. Number 9. Hill Street Blues depicted police brutality, corruption, and institutional racism on primetime television at a time when most cop shows were still presenting law enforcement as an uncomplicated force for clean, satisfying justice. This was not accidental, and it was not without consequence. The show received significant pushback from police organizations across the country, some of whom mounted formal objection campaigns and lobbied local affiliates to drop the series. Certain police unions argued that the show was anti-cop propaganda dressed up as drama. They objected to storylines involving officers planting evidence, using excessive force, accepting bribes, and operating with flagrant disregard for civil rights. Bochco's response to these objections was, essentially, yes, that is what we're depicting because that is what happens. He had done his research, the writers had done theirs. Consultants with actual law enforcement backgrounds had confirmed that the institutional failures portrayed on the show were not exaggerations. They were, in many precincts, understatements. The show's willingness to hold that line, to not soften its critique in the face of organized pressure, was genuinely courageous for its era. And it didn't make anyone at NBC sleep any easier either. Number 10. The famous opening sequence of Hill Street Blues, that handheld documentary-style camera work that made everything feel immediate and unstaged, was not widely celebrated when it first appeared. It made people nauseous, literally. Television in 1981 used locked-off cameras, stable frames, clean compositions. The deliberate shakiness of Hill Street's cinematography was jarring in a physiological sense for viewers conditioned to the visual grammar of traditional TV. Complaints flooded NBC. People called it amateurish. Critics compared it unfavorably to a student film. One reviewer wrote that he spent the first episode waiting for the camera crew to sort themselves out. Director Robert Butler, who shot the pilot, had fought hard for the style, arguing that stability and polish were exactly what the show needed to avoid, that the camera should feel like another officer working the floor. Butler and Bochco won the argument. The style stayed, and within 2 seasons, that same handheld aesthetic had been imitated across primetime television so thoroughly that it began to look like the standard rather than the exception. Television didn't just accept the shakiness eventually, it adopted it entirely, which means every wobbly dramatic scene you've watched since 1983 owes a quiet, nauseous debt to Hill Street Blues. Number 11. Barbara Bosson, who played the sharp-tongued, perpetually exasperated Faye Furillo, Frank's nightmare ex-wife who haunted the precinct like a well-dressed storm system, was married to Stephen Bachko in real life during the show's entire run, which means that every scene where Faye screamed at Frank, manipulated situations for her own benefit, or made everyone in the building deeply uncomfortable was written, at least in part, by the woman's actual husband. Whether that was cathartic, collaborative, or quietly devastating depends entirely on who you ask. Cast members have noted that the dynamic on set during Bosson's scenes carried a particular charge that was difficult to fully explain. Boschko maintained publicly that Faye was not based on Bosson, that the character existed independently of their marriage. Jan de Bosson has been considerably less definitive on the subject in various interviews over the years. What's documented is that the marriage eventually ended, and that Bosson was quietly written off the show in a manner that she later described as painful and professionally humiliating. Being fired from your husband's show while still married to him is a particular kind of Hollywood darkness that no award ceremony ever quite covers adequately. Faye Furillo deserved better. Arguably, so did Barbara Bosson. Number 12. The show's groundbreaking approach to serialized storytelling, where storylines ran for weeks, characters evolved slowly, and nothing was neatly resolved in 44 minutes, was so foreign to network television standards that NBC's Standards and Practices Department essentially had no framework for reviewing it. Their existing guidelines were built around episodic structure, where each episode reset to neutral, and every moral question found its answer before the credits rolled. Hill Street refused that entirely. Storylines about police corruption ran for half a season without resolution. Characters made terrible decisions that followed them forward, rather than disappearing conveniently. A rape storyline was handled with such unflinching honesty across multiple episodes that Standards and Practices reportedly flagged it 6 separate times, without ever finding specific grounds to demand changes. Because the content was never exploitative, just truthful in a way the rulebook hadn't anticipated. Boschko later said, navigating network standards on Hill Street felt like being audited by people who had never seen the product they were supposed to be auditing. The irony is that the very complexity that confused NBC's oversight mechanisms is exactly what television critics and academics now study as the foundational architecture of modern prestige drama. The rulebook didn't cover Hill Street because Hill Street was writing a new one. Number 13. Keel Martin, who played the street-smart, morally flexible detective J.D. LaRue, a man permanently on the wrong side of a good decision, was battling serious personal demons throughout much of the show's run that mirrored his character's struggles with uncomfortable accuracy. LaRue was written as a charming wreck, a man whose potential was perpetually sabotaged by his own worst impulses. Martin brought a lived authenticity to those qualities that his castmates found both impressive and, at times, genuinely worrying. The line between performance and autobiography appeared thin in ways that nobody on set discussed openly, but most people quietly noticed. Martin died in 1990 at the age of 46, just a few years after the show ended, and tributes from colleagues were marked by that particular kind of grief that carries unfinished sentences inside it. The kind where people say he was talented and complicated and leave significant space around both words. LaRue was one of television's great flawed characters precisely because the man playing him understood the particular brand of self-destruction from somewhere uncomfortably close to the inside. That kind of performance leaves a mark on a show. It also leaves a mark on the person giving it. Number 14. Hill Street Blues won 8 Emmy Awards in its very first eligible season, a record that stood for decades and that the television industry greeted with a mixture of genuine celebration and barely concealed panic. The panic came from what the wins implied. If this show was now the standard, then virtually everything else on television was, by comparison, insufficient. showrunners across the industry reportedly watched the Emmy broadcast with the specific expression of people reassessing major life choices. What made the wins particularly striking was the category of Outstanding Drama Series, which Hill Street took from a field of competitors that included shows far more traditionally constructed, far more network-friendly, and far better rated at the time. The Emmy voters essentially declared that critical ambition mattered more than audience numbers, a statement that networks had absolutely not agreed to in advance and weren't entirely comfortable with afterward. NBC celebrated loudly and publicly, while privately scrambling to understand how to replicate the success without actually giving another showrunner Bachko-level autonomy. The answer, it turned out, was that you couldn't. You either trusted the vision completely or you got something else entirely. Most networks chose something else entirely, a choice they're probably still making today, honestly. Number 15. The precinct building, used as the exterior for Hill Street Blues, was a real structure in a genuinely deteriorating neighborhood. Chosen specifically because Kochko wanted the physical environment to carry its own authentic weight of institutional decay. Production designers were instructed not to clean it up, not to make it photogenic, not to soften the visual story the building told about a city that had stopped investing in its own infrastructure. This commitment to environmental authenticity extended to the interior sets, which were deliberately cramped, cluttered, and lit with the palm kind of fluorescent harshness that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Set decorators were told to make it feel used, not dressed. The result was a precinct that functioned almost as a character in its own right. A physical space that confirmed everything the scripts were saying about systemic neglect, without anyone having to write a single line of dialogue about it. What television sets in 1981 were routinely designed to be attractive and aspirational. Hill Street's set was designed to be honest. The difference in emotional effect was immediate and significant. Viewers responded to it without being able to fully articulate why. The building looked like it needed help, which was precisely the point. Number 16. The relationship between Hill Street Blues and the city of Chicago, whose political and social landscape heavily influenced the show's DNA, was complicated by the fact that the show was not actually filmed in Chicago and made no particular effort to pretend it was set there specifically. The fictional Hill Street precinct existed in an unnamed American city that borrowed liberally from Chicago, New York, Detroit, and every other major urban center, simultaneously wrestling with crime, poverty, and political dysfunction in the early 1980s. This deliberate ambiguity was a creative choice with sharp political implications. By refusing to name the city, Bochco ensured the show couldn't be dismissed as a localized problem or a specific anomaly. The corruption, the despair, the institutional failure, all of it belonged to everywhere, and therefore to everyone. Several cities reportedly recognized themselves anyway, and were not entirely pleased about it. One Midwestern mayor allegedly contacted NBC to formally object to what he perceived as an unflattering portrayal of his city, despite the show never naming any city at all, which is, when you think about it, one of the most revealing non-denials in television history, the shoe fit. He just didn't want anyone noticing him putting it on. Number 17. Torian Block, who played Detective Neil Washington with quiet intensity and unshakable moral clarity, carried a personal story running parallel to the show that almost nobody knew about during filming. Black was in the process of adopting multiple children as a single father throughout Hill Street's run, eventually adopting 8 children total, a fact that only became widely known years after the show ended. He was showing up to play one of television's most grounded, responsible characters while simultaneously building one of the most quietly extraordinary private lives of anyone in the cast. There's something almost poetically appropriate about that. Washington was the character you trusted when everything around him was unraveling. Black, it turned out, was living a version of that reliability in a way that had nothing to do with performance. His castmates who learned about the adoptions during production described a particular recontextualization of his work, suddenly understanding that the steadiness he brought to Washington wasn't manufactured in a rehearsal room. It came from someone who had genuinely decided what kind of person he was going to be. In a show filled with complicated people making complicated choices, Black was something rarer. He was simply, consistently, the real thing. Number 18. The music of Hill Street Blues, composed by Mike Post, became one of the most recognizable television themes of the entire decade. And it almost didn't make it into the show at all. Bolshko had initially envisioned the series running without a traditional theme, leaning entirely into ambient pre-sync noise as its sonic identity. Yet Post was brought in late and given limited creative direction beyond make it feel urban and tired and alive all at once. What he produced was a spare, melancholic piano melody that felt less like a television theme and more like something you'd hear from a window at 2 in the morning in a city that never fully quiets down. NBC executives initially wanted something more energetic, more traditionally heroic, something that announced the show with the confident swagger of a lineup introduction. Post and Boschko pushed for the quiet version. The theme went to #1 on the Billboard charts in 1981, which nobody predicted, which Post has described as one of the more surreal professional experiences of his career. A sad little piano melody written for a show about institutional exhaustion became a pop hit. Tough on America in 1981 apparently needed exactly that specific kind of beautiful melancholy, and Mike Post delivered it without anyone fully understanding that's what was being asked for. And number 19. By its final season in 1987, Hill Street Blues was a fundamentally different show than the one that had premiered 6 years earlier, and not entirely by design. The cast had changed dramatically. Key writers had departed. Boschko himself had been gone for 2 years. What remained was a production carrying the weight of its own legacy while trying to generate the energy of something still vital and ongoing. Ratings had declined steadily. The show that had once been too challenging for mainstream audiences had become, through the gradual shift of television's landscape, almost comfortable by comparison with what was following in its wake. In shows inspired by Hill Street, shows that had absorbed its lessons and pushed them further, were now the provocative new thing. Hill Street had become the institution it once interrogated. Cast members from that final period have described a melancholy on set that nobody formally acknowledged, but everyone felt. The particular sadness of something great that has outlasted its own revolution. The finale aired without major ceremony. There was no cultural event, no countdown, no moment of collective mourning, proportional to what the show had actually meant. It just ended, which is, in its own way, the most Hill Street Blues conclusion possible. Quiet, honest, a little heartbreaking. Number 20. The lasting damage Hill Street Blues did to conventional television. And damage is absolutely the right word. Delivered with complete affection, cannot be overstated. Every serialized drama that followed, every morally complex protagonist, every season-long storyline, every show that trusted its audience to keep up without hand-holding owes a structural debt to what Bolko and Kozol built in that writer's room. The Wire, The Sopranos, NYPD Blue, ER. Every single one of them walked through a door that Hill Street Blues kicked open, while NBC executives watched nervously from the hallway. David Simon has cited it. David Chase has cited it. Writers who have never publicly cited it are working in a tradition it created, and yet it remains, in popular cultural memory, slightly less celebrated than the shows it made possible, which is the specific injustice reserved for things that were first. The pioneers get the arrows, and the settlers get the monuments. Hill Street Blues took every arrow early American television had and kept walking. The monument it deserves has never quite been built to scale, but it's there. And somewhere behind every great drama you've ever loved, there's a shaky handheld camera, a too crowded room, and someone saying, "Let's be careful out there." Bonus fact. After the show ended, the roll call set, that cramped, deliberately unglamorous room where Sergeant Esterhaus delivered his briefings, and the entire emotional tone of each episode was established in its opening minutes, was quietly dismantled without any formal preservation effort. No museum claimed it. No studio kept it intact as a piece of television history. The chairs, the desks, the bulletin boards covered in the accumulated texture of 6 seasons, all of it dispersed. Sold off, or simply discarded in the practical machinery of a production wrapping and a soundstage being cleared for whatever came next. When cast members have been asked about it in retrospect, several have expressed genuine surprise that nothing was saved. Not disbelief that a corporation failed to act sentimentally, because nobody is surprised by that, but something quieter, a small, private grief that the physical place where something genuinely important happened simply no longer exists anywhere in the world. Conrad's chair is gone. Cirillo's desk is gone. The room where American television changed is gone. What remains is the work itself, which is ultimately the only preservation that ever really matters. But still, someone should have kept the chairs.